The fluorescent lights were humming, that electric buzz you only notice in hospital corridors when everything else goes silent. I remember lying there on that gurney, counting ceiling tiles, because if I stopped counting, I'd have to face what was about to happen. 23, 24. The tiles had tiny perforations in them, thousands of little holes that I imagined were breathing along with me, in and out, in and out. My hands were shaking, and not just from the pre-op sedatives they'd already given me. The trembling started deep in my bones, radiating outward until even my breath seemed to quiver in my chest. I kept looking toward the door, waiting for Dave to come through it with that crooked smile of his, the one that always made me feel like everything would be okay. But the door stayed closed, and the clock kept ticking. The nurse patted my hand, and I saw something in her eyes that made my stomach drop. It was pity. Pure, unfiltered pity. She'd probably seen this before, hadn't she? Women wheeled into surgery alone, husbands who had better things to do. I wanted to explain to her that Dave was different, that he was just busy, that he'd promised to be there, but work had this urgent thing and he'd make it up to me. But the words stuck in my throat like cotton, and before I could say anything, they were wheeling me through those double doors, and the anesthesiologist was asking me to count backward from 10. I made it to 7 before everything went black. When I woke up, my mouth tasted like copper and old pennies left in the rain, metallic and wrong. My abdomen felt like someone had set fire to it from the inside, each breath fanning flames that spread through my core. The recovery room was all beeping machines and that same fluorescent hum, and I was alone, so completely alone. The loneliness had weight to it, pressing down on my chest almost as heavily as the surgical pain. A different nurse, this one with kind eyes and gray hair, handed me my phone. There was a voicemail from Dave. His voice sounded rushed, distracted. Something about a quarterly meeting that couldn't be rescheduled, about how he'd tried to get out of it but Marcus from corporate was being difficult, about how he'd be there as soon as he could. As soon as he could. I listened to that message 3 times, each time hearing something new in the spaces between his words. The way he cleared his throat before he said sorry, the sound of papers shuffling in the background, the casual tone, like he was explaining why he'd be late for dinner, not why he'd abandoned his wife during surgery. I need to back up. I need to tell you how we got here, because none of this makes sense without context. 3 months earlier, everything was fine, or that's what I kept telling myself anyway. Dave and I had been married for 22 years. We met at a company picnic in Phoenix back when I was still painting on weekends, and he was a junior analyst trying to make a name for himself. He used to say I was the only person who could make a spreadsheet sound romantic, which wasn't true, but it made me laugh. We built a life together in Scottsdale, in one of those houses with the terracotta roof tiles and the backyard that blazes with bougainvillea every spring. We had 2 kids, Emma and Tyler, both grown now and living their own lives in different cities. Dave climbed the corporate ladder while I managed the home, and somewhere in that climb, I think we both forgot to look at each other. The medical issues started about 6 months before the surgery. Nothing dramatic at first, just this persistent pain in my lower abdomen that wouldn't go away. I ignored it for weeks because that's what you do when you're busy being everyone else's support system. You push through, you take aspirin, you convince yourself it's stress or bad posture or those yoga positions you tried that one time. But eventually, the pain got loud enough that I couldn't pretend anymore. My doctor, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Martinez who'd been treating me for years, ordered tests. Lots of tests. And then came the diagnosis that made my hands go numb. A mass that needed to come out. Surgery required. The sooner the better. She said it with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from delivering bad news too many times, and I sat there in her office nodding like I understood when really all I could think about was how I'd have to tell Dave and the kids and whether this meant I was going to die. I told Dave that night over dinner. He was distracted, checking his phone between bites of the chicken casserole I'd made, the one that usually got him talking about his day. The fork made small clinking sounds against the plate, punctuating the silence between us. When I finally got the words out, my voice smaller than I'd intended, he looked up at me with this expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't fear or concern. It was inconvenience, like I'd just told him the car needed an oil change when he had a golf game planned. His eyes flickered back to his phone screen for just a second before returning to my face, and that tiny gesture told me everything I needed to know about where I ranked on his list of priorities. He said all the right things, of course. Asked about the surgery date, promised he'd be there, squeezed my hand across the table. But his eyes kept drifting back to his phone, and I could see the calculations happening behind them. How much work would he miss? What meetings would need to be rescheduled? I wanted to scream at him, to shake him, and ask when I'd become just another item on his to-do list. But I didn't. I just smiled and said thank you, and cleared the dishes while he made calls in his study. The weeks leading up to the surgery were a blur of pre-op appointments and insurance paperwork, and trying to keep my anxiety from eating me alive. Dave was busy. He was always busy. There was this merger happening at work, something massive that required him to be in the office until 9 or 10 most nights. I understood. I really did. Or I told myself I did. Because understanding was easier than admitting that I was terrified and needed him and he wasn't there. Have you ever felt like you're drowning in the shallow end of the pool? Like the water is barely over your head, but you still can't breathe? That's what those weeks felt like. Everyone kept telling me I was strong, that I'd get through this, that everything would be fine. But strong is just another word for alone when you think about it. Strong means you don't get to ask for help. Strong means you swallow the fear and put on a brave face and pretend that waking up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat doesn't count as falling apart. The night before the surgery, Dave came home late. I'd made his favorite dinner, pot roast with those little potatoes he likes, thinking maybe we could have one of those meaningful conversations couples are supposed to have before something serious. But he was exhausted, and there was some crisis with the Tokyo office, and could we please just eat quickly so he could finish his presentation? I sat across from him, watching him shovel food into his mouth while typing on his laptop, and I felt something crack inside me. Something small but fundamental, like the first hairline fracture in a windshield that you know is eventually going to spider across the entire thing. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there in the dark, listening to Dave snore beside me, and I thought about all the moments that had led us here, the missed anniversaries, the family dinners where he was physically present, but mentally somewhere in a conference room, the way he'd stopped asking about my day because he knew I'd just say fine and he wouldn't have to listen to the real answer. I'd convinced myself it was normal, this slow erosion of connection. Everyone's marriage goes through phases, right? Everyone gets busy. Everyone drifts. But lying there in the dark with surgery looming in the morning, I couldn't hide behind those excuses anymore. Because normal husbands don't prioritize quarterly reports over their wife's medical crisis. Normal husbands show up. The morning of the surgery, I woke up at 5. Dave was already dressed, pacing in the kitchen with his phone pressed to his ear. When he saw me, he covered the receiver and mouthed that he had to take this call. I nodded and made coffee I wasn't allowed to drink, my hands shaking so badly I spilled grounds all over the counter. He finished his call and kissed my forehead, distracted, already mentally somewhere else. He promised again that he'd be there. Promised he'd meet me at the hospital. Promised he'd be in the waiting room when I came out of surgery. I wanted to believe him so badly. I clung to those promises like a life raft, even as some deeper part of me was already starting to suspect they were made of air. The drive to the hospital was surreal. I went alone because Dave had that early morning meeting, but he'd catch up, he said. He'd be there before they wheeled me in. I parked in the massive garage and walked through those automatic doors into the too bright lobby, and I kept checking my phone, waiting for his text saying he was on his way. But my phone stayed silent except for a group message from Emma and Tyler wishing me luck. They'd both offered to fly home, but I'd told them not to worry, that Dad would be there, that everything would be fine. I was so good at lying to everyone, including myself. Check-in was a blur of paperwork and plastic wristbands and nurses asking the same questions over and over. Allergies? No. Previous surgeries? An appendectomy when I was 19? Emergency contact? I gave them Dave's number and tried not to think about whether he'd actually answer if they called. They led me to a pre-op room and gave me a gown that tied in the back and left me feeling exposed and ridiculous. I changed and sat on the edge of the bed, feet dangling, staring at the door. He'll come, I told myself. He'll walk through that door any minute now. But minutes turned into an hour, and the only person who walked through that door was the anesthesiologist. A cheerful man with an accent I couldn't place, asking me to sign more forms. Then Dr. Martinez appeared, reviewing the procedure one more time, her voice calm and professional. She asked if my husband was here yet, and I heard myself say he was on his way, probably just stuck in traffic. You know how Scottsdale roads can be in the morning? She nodded, but I saw that same look the first nurse had given me. Pity. They started the IV, and the pre-op sedatives made everything soft and swimmy around the edges. That's when my phone buzzed. Finally. But it wasn't a text saying he was here. It was a text saying he was so sorry. There was this emergency with Marcus in the Tokyo office, and he'd tried everything, but he just couldn't get away right now. He'd be there as soon as the meeting wrapped up. He loved me. He was thinking of me. I stared at that text until the words blurred. Some part of my sedated brain wanted to throw the phone across the room, wanted to scream, wanted to call him back and ask how the hell a quarterly meeting trumped his wife's surgery. But the drugs were making everything feel distant and unimportant. And anyway, what was the point? He'd made his choice. Work over me. Again. That's when the nurse with the kind eyes patted my hand, and I saw that pity again, and I understood something I'd been avoiding for months. This wasn't new. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a pattern, and I'd been the only one refusing to see it. They wheeled me down that fluorescent corridor, and I counted ceiling tiles, and I went under anesthesia, and somewhere in the back of my sedated mind, I knew that when I woke up, things would be different. They had to be. Because you can only break a promise so many times before it stops being a promise and starts being a lie. And Dave had been lying to me for a very long time. The recovery room was exactly as awful as I'd imagined. My mouth was dry, my throat hurt from the breathing tube, and the pain in my abdomen was this dull, spreading ache that made me want to curl into a ball. But mostly, I just felt empty. Hollow. Like someone had scooped out more than just the mass during surgery. The nurse with the gray hair, her name tag said Margaret, was the one who gave me my phone. She did it gently, carefully, like she was handing me something fragile. And maybe she could see on my face what I was about to find, because she squeezed my shoulder before walking away to give me privacy. The voicemail was worse than the text. At least with the text, I could imagine he'd been too busy to call. But hearing his voice, so casual and rushed, talking about Marcus and corporate and how he'd tried to reschedule, but these things happen. These things happen. Like my surgery was a dentist appointment that got bumped. Like I was something that could be rescheduled. I listened to that voicemail 3 times, and each time I heard something new. The first time, I heard the apology. The second time, I heard the excuse. The third time, I heard the absolute absence of concern in his voice. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about the meeting, and that distinction, small as it might seem, changed everything. Margaret came back and helped me sit up slowly. She asked if there was anyone she should call to pick me up later, and I opened my mouth to say my husband, but the words stuck. Because what was I supposed to say? That my husband was too busy with a quarterly report to be here? That I'd have to call a rideshare to get home from surgery because my partner of 22 years had better things to do? I ended up calling Joan. Sweet, wonderful Joan, who I hadn't talked to in months because I'd been so busy being the perfect wife to a husband who barely noticed. She answered on the second ring, and when I told her what happened, There was this long silence on the other end. Then she said 2 words that made me start crying right there in the recovery room. She said, "Enough already." And she was right. It was enough. More than enough. It had been enough for a long time, but I'd been too scared or too stubborn or too invested in the lie of my perfect marriage to admit it. Joan picked me up 3 hours later. Dave had sent 2 more texts, both apologizing, both promising he'd be home soon. I didn't respond to either of them. I just let Joan help me into her car and drive me home. And when we pulled into the driveway and I saw that Dave's car wasn't there, I wasn't even surprised. The house was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Coffee grounds still on the counter. The breakfast dishes Dave had promised to do still in the sink. Everything frozen in that moment before I'd walked out the door expecting my husband to show up for me. It felt like walking into a museum of my own delusions. Joan helped me to the couch and made tea I couldn't really drink yet, and then she sat down across from me and asked the question I'd been avoiding for months. When did it get this bad? And I didn't know how to answer that. Because it had been gradual, hadn't it? A series of small betrayals that individually seemed forgivable, but together created this massive wall between us. The forgotten anniversary that became forgotten birthdays, that became forgotten conversations that became this. Sitting on my couch after surgery, alone except for a friend I'd been too embarrassed to admit I needed. I'd read somewhere that about 5% of seniors suffer physical abuse. And while Dave had never hit me, never even raised his hand, this felt like abuse too. This systematic neglect, this relegation of my needs to the bottom of his priority list, this erosion of my sense of worth until I was grateful for crumbs of his attention. Maybe you can't see these bruises, but they're there, they're deep, and they hurt, and they're real. Joan stayed with me until evening. We didn't talk much. She just sat there, solid and present, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I felt. Around 7, we heard the garage door open. Dave was home. He came in carrying flowers from the hospital gift shop, the kind they sell in those sad little cellophane wraps. He looked tired, rumpled, guilty. He started apologizing immediately, explaining about the meeting, about Marcus, about how he'd gotten here as fast as he could. I sat there on the couch, still in pain, still exhausted, and I listened to him talk. And I realized I'd heard this speech before. Different details, same script. Always work. Always an emergency. Always something more important than me. Joan stood up. She looked at Dave with an expression I'd never seen on her usually gentle face. Then she looked at me and asked if I wanted her to stay. I almost said yes. Almost asked her to be the buffer between me and this conversation I knew we needed to have. But I shook my head, and she squeezed my hand and left. And then it was just me and Dave and those gas station flowers and 22 years of accumulated resentment sitting between us like a third person. I asked him where he'd been. He started to explain again, and I cut him off. I asked him to tell me the truth. Was the meeting really that important? Was there really no way he could have left? Or had he just not wanted to? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. He tried to backtrack, to explain, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about all the times I'd justified his absence, all the times I'd told myself that his work was important, that he was providing for us, that I should be grateful. I'd sacrificed so much to support his career. I'd given up painting, something I loved, because we decided I should focus on the home. I'd turned down a scholarship to an art program in Santa Fe when we first got married because Dave's job was in Phoenix and we needed the stability. I'd put my dreams in a box labeled later, and later had turned into never. I used to paint landscapes. Did you know that? Sunsets over the desert, the way the light hits the superstitions in the morning, the impossible colors of a Scottsdale summer sky. I was good at it too. Really good. But somewhere between corporate dinners and PTA meetings, and making sure Dave's shirts were ironed for his presentations, I'd forgotten how to hold a brush. I'd forgotten what it felt like to create something just for the joy of creating it. And for what? So I could sit here alone after surgery while my husband prioritized a quarterly report? Dave was still talking, still explaining. But I wasn't that woman anymore, the woman who listened to excuses and nodded and forgave. Surgery had cut out more than just a mass. It had cut through the fog of denial I'd been living in. I told Dave to stop, just stop talking. And then I asked him a question that had been building in me for months. When was the last time he'd chosen me? He opened his mouth, closed it, tried to think of an answer. And the fact that he had to think, that he couldn't immediately point to a moment when I'd been his priority, that was answer enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. The pain medication made me groggy, but my mind wouldn't shut off. I kept replaying the conversation, the look on Dave's face when he couldn't answer my question. Around 2 a.m, I got up, slowly, carefully, and went to the spare room where I used to have my art supplies. Most of it was buried under boxes of old tax returns and Dave's college textbooks, but I found my easel in the back corner, dusty and forgotten. I stood there looking at it in the dim light, this relic of who I used to be, and something inside me just broke open. I started crying, and once I started, I couldn't stop. I cried for the 22 years I'd spent being small. I cried for the paintings I'd never created. I cried for the woman in the scholarship letter who'd been so excited about her future. I cried for the girl who'd believed that love meant sacrifice and that sacrifice would be rewarded. But mostly, I cried because I finally understood what I'd been refusing to see. I'd been so focused on being a good wife that I'd forgotten to be a whole person. The next few days were a fog of pain medication and sleeping and avoiding Dave. He tried to make it up to me. He took time off work, made me soup, sat with me while I recovered. But there was this new distance between us, this crack that had finally become visible. Every time he did something nice, I found myself wondering if it was genuine or just guilt. Every time he asked how I was feeling, I heard the subtext, "Are you okay enough that I can stop feeling bad and go back to work?" I started paying attention to things I'd been ignoring, the way he checked his phone during dinner, the way his eyes glazed over when I talked about my day, the way he'd rather stay late at the office than come home to me. These weren't new behaviors. I'd just been pretending they didn't matter. A week after the surgery, I had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Martinez. Dave offered to drive me, but I said no. I called Joan instead. Dr. Martinez said the surgery went well, that they'd removed the mass completely, that I was healing nicely. She asked how I was doing otherwise, and something in the way she asked made me understand she wasn't just talking about my physical health. I told her about Dave missing the surgery, about the pattern of absences, about feeling invisible in my own marriage, and she listened with that same calm attention she'd given my medical symptoms, and then she said something that stuck with me. She said sometimes our bodies know things our minds aren't ready to admit. Sometimes illness is our body's way of making us stop and pay attention to what we've been avoiding. I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. The persistent pain that had led to the diagnosis, the way my body had literally forced me to stop and deal with something wrong. Maybe it wasn't just about the mass. Maybe it was about everything I'd been carrying that I wasn't meant to carry anymore. It was around this time that things started happening with the kids. Emma called one evening, upset about something at work, wanting to talk. I was in the middle of telling her about a similar situation I'd dealt with when I heard Dave's voice in the background, telling Tyler about some game. He was home. He was in the house. But he hadn't come to check on me or see how I was doing. He was just in his study, doing his own thing, assuming I was fine because I was always fine. And that's when it hit me. The kids had learned this from us. They'd grown up watching their father prioritize work and their mother accept it. They'd learned that love looks like absence and excuses. They'd learned that it's normal for one person to give everything while the other takes it all for granted. I didn't want that for them. I didn't want Emma to end up married to someone like Dave. I didn't want Tyler to become someone like Dave. But more than that, I didn't want this for me anymore. The breaking point came 3 weeks after the surgery. I was finally feeling well enough to move around normally, and I decided to clean out the spare room. Not to paint yet, I wasn't ready for that, but just to clear the space. Make it mine again. While I was moving boxes, I found an old sketchbook from before Emma was born. I sat down on the floor, surrounded by dust and old memories, and I flipped through it. The drawings were good, really good, better than I remembered. There were landscapes and portraits, and these abstract pieces that captured feeling more than image. And tucked in the back was a letter. The acceptance letter from that art program in Santa Fe. The scholarship that would have covered tuition and housing. The future I'd given up because Dave's job was in Phoenix and someone had to be practical. I read that letter, all these years later, and I felt something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was. I felt angry, not sad, not disappointed, angry. Because I'd been telling myself that giving up the scholarship was a mutual decision, that it was what couples do, compromise, that it was noble and mature and the right choice. But sitting there on the floor of that spare room, I realized it wasn't a compromise at all. A compromise is when both people give something up. This was just me giving up while Dave took. I'd sacrificed my art, my dreams, my identity, and for what? So he could build a career while I built a home he was never in? So he could climb the corporate ladder while I held it steady? So he could become someone while I became no one? The anger felt clean, sharp, real. And I held on to it like a lifeline, because anger meant I still cared. Anger meant I wasn't completely numb yet. I was still sitting there, holding that letter, when Dave came home from work. He found me in the spare room and asked what I was doing. I showed him the letter, told him I'd been thinking about Santa Fe, about what my life might have looked like if I'd gone. He got defensive immediately, started talking about how we'd made that decision together, how it had been the practical choice, how his job had health insurance and stability, and we'd needed those things. And he was right, technically. We had needed those things. But that wasn't the point, and he didn't even realize it. The point was that in 22 years of marriage, I couldn't think of a single time when he'd been the one to sacrifice, a single time when his career had taken a back seat to my dreams or my needs or even my health. It was always me bending, me accommodating, me putting myself aside. And that night, sitting in that dusty spare room holding a letter from my past, I stopped bending. I told Dave I wanted to separate. The look on his face would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. Pure shock, like I'd suggested we move to Mars. He asked where this was coming from, what had changed. We could work on things, he said. He could do better. He promised he'd be more present. But I'd heard those promises before, after every missed anniversary, after every forgotten birthday, after every time he chose work over family. The promises always sounded good in the moment, but they never stuck, because Dave didn't want to change. He wanted me to stop complaining. I told him I wasn't asking anymore. I was telling I needed space, time to figure out who I was outside of being his wife, and if he really loved me the way he claimed to, he'd give me that. He moved out the next week, into a corporate apartment near his office, which honestly was probably more convenient for him anyway. The house felt strange without him, emptier, but also somehow lighter, like a pressure I hadn't realized I was under had finally lifted. Joan came over that first night, brought wine and takeout, and sat with me while I cried. Not because I missed Dave exactly, but because I was mourning all those years I'd spent being small. All that time I'd wasted trying to make myself fit into a space that was never meant for me. But something else was happening too. Something I didn't expect. Without Dave there, without the constant pressure to be the perfect wife, I started remembering how to breathe. Started noticing things, the way morning light hit the kitchen counter. the quiet of the house at night, the freedom of not having to plan my day around someone else's schedule. I was starting to find myself again, and it terrified me. Because what if the woman I found wasn't the woman I'd been pretending to be all these years? What if she was someone else entirely? But also, what if she was someone I actually liked? The days turned into weeks, and I slowly began to reclaim my space. I moved Dave's boxes out of the spare room completely, threw away the old tax returns and college textbooks, created a space that was mine. I didn't start painting yet. I wasn't ready, but I cleaned my brushes, organized my paints, set up the easel near the window where the light was best. Emma and Tyler called regularly. They were confused about the separation, wanted to know if we were getting divorced, if there was someone else, if we could work it out. I tried to explain, but how do you tell your adult children that you've been disappearing for their entire lives and you're only now trying to come back? I told them I loved their father, that this wasn't about anger or blame, that it was about needing to remember who I was before I became wife and mother. They didn't really understand, not yet, but they said they supported me, and that was enough. It was during one of these quiet weeks alone that I started to notice my health improving in ways I hadn't expected. The recovery from surgery was going well, obviously, but it was more than that. I was sleeping better, eating better. The constant low-level anxiety I'd been living with for years had eased. My body was telling me what my mind had been too scared to admit. I was better without Dave. Not because he was a bad person. He wasn't. He was just a person who'd gotten comfortable with me carrying everything while he pursued his ambitions. And I'd let him. I'd enabled it by never demanding more, by accepting crumbs and calling it a meal. One afternoon, about a month into the separation, Joan came over with a stack of books. Self-help stuff mostly. Books about codependency and boundaries and learning to value yourself. I rolled my eyes at first, but then I started reading. And I saw myself on every page, the people pleaser, the conflict avoider, the woman who'd rather shrink herself than make waves. One book talked about sacrifice in relationships. It said that healthy sacrifice should be reciprocal and chosen. That when only one person is sacrificing, it's not partnership, it's servitude. I read that line 3 times, letting it sink in. Servitude. Is that what I'd been doing all these years? Serving Dave's ambitions while mine collected dust? I thought about the scholarship again, about Santa Fe and painting and the life I might have had. And I realized something important. It wasn't too late. I was 57, not 97. I had time. I had the settlement from the separation that Dave had agreed to. I had Joan and the kids, and most importantly, I had myself. I could still paint. I could still create. I could still become. That night, I pulled out my old paints, set up a canvas, and for the first time in over 20 years, I painted. It wasn't good. My hands were shaky, and I'd forgotten most of the techniques I'd learned. But it didn't matter, because I was doing it. I was creating something that was mine and mine alone. I painted until 2 a.m, and when I finally stepped back to look at what I'd made, I started crying. Because on that canvas was a sunset, a Scottsdale sunset with those impossible pinks and oranges and purples that people who've never seen them think must be exaggerated. And it was beautiful, not because of the technique or the composition, but because I'd made it. After all these years of silence, I'd finally found my voice again. And it had been there all along, just waiting for me to remember. The separation dragged on through spring and into summer. Dave wanted to reconcile. He kept calling, texting, showing up at the house with flowers and apologies. He'd changed, he said. He understood now. He'd go to counseling. He'd cut back on work. He'd do whatever it took. But I wasn't ready. Maybe I'd never be ready. Because every time I saw him, I remembered that recovery room. I remembered lying there alone after surgery, holding my phone with his voicemail about the quarterly meeting. And I couldn't unhear the casual dismissal in his voice, couldn't unfeel the realization that I'd married a man who would always choose work over me. Joan helped me through those months. She was there when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was being too harsh or too unforgiving. She reminded me that healing wasn't the same as going back, that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away. But it was another conversation, one with a stranger, that really opened my eyes to how deep the problem went. I'd started going to a support group for women going through divorce. Not because I was definitely getting divorced, but because I needed to talk to people who understood. One evening, a woman named Patricia shared her story. She'd been married for 30 years to a man who controlled every aspect of her life. Where she went, who she saw, what she wore. And she'd believed it was love. That's what he told her. That's what his family told her. That's what she told herself. It wasn't until her daughter got engaged and started planning her wedding that Patricia saw the pattern. Her daughter's fiancé was exactly like Patricia's husband, controlling, possessive, isolating. And Patricia watched her daughter making all the same excuses she'd made. He just loves me so much. He just worries about me. He just wants what's best for me. Patricia had to choose between supporting her daughter's relationship or telling her the truth. And in that moment, she realized she couldn't model one thing and preach another. She couldn't tell her daughter to be strong while she herself stayed weak. So she left, filed for divorce, lost most of her family in the process because they sided with her husband. But she got her daughter back, and herself. Listening to Patricia's story, I thought about Emma and Tyler, about what I was teaching them by staying or leaving, about the kind of relationships they'd build based on what they'd seen in me and Dave. And I knew, sitting in that church basement surrounded by other women who'd finally said enough, that I couldn't go back. Not for me, not for them, not for any future grandchildren who might someday need to know that it's never too late to choose yourself. That night, I went home and I called a lawyer. Not to file for divorce yet, but to understand my options, to know what I was entitled to start planning for a future that was mine alone. The lawyer's name was Susan, and she was about my age with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She asked me to tell her my story, and I did. All of it. The missed surgery, the pattern of neglect, the sacrifices I'd made, the life I'd given up. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said something I wasn't expecting. She said she saw cases like mine all the time. Women who'd spent decades supporting their husbands' careers, only to be left with nothing when the marriage ended. Women who'd sacrificed their own earning potential, their own social security, their own futures, and the law barely protected them. She explained that even though I'd been the one who'd supported Dave's climb up the corporate ladder, I'd have to fight for what I deserved in the divorce, that judges often didn't see domestic labor as real work, that I'd need documentation, evidence, proof that I'd contributed to his success. I left her office feeling simultaneously empowered and furious. Empowered because I finally had someone in my corner who understood. Furious because why did I need to prove my worth? Why wasn't it obvious that 22 years of managing his life had value? But I started gathering evidence anyway. Bank statements showing how I'd managed our finances, emails I'd sent on Dave's behalf to clients, photos from corporate events I'd organized, testimonials from colleagues about how I'd been the secret weapon behind his success. It was exhausting, humiliating, having to quantify my life in terms someone else could understand. But it was also clarifying, because with every document I gathered, I saw the pattern more clearly. I hadn't just sacrificed my art. I'd sacrificed everything, my time, my energy, my identity, all so Dave could succeed, and he'd let me. He'd taken everything I gave and asked for more, and when I finally had nothing left to give, he'd acted surprised that I was empty. During this time, I also started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Chen, and she specialized in helping women navigate late-life transitions. She asked me to do an exercise in our second session. She asked me to describe myself without using any relational terms. No wife, no mother, no daughter. Just me. I couldn't do it. I sat there for 15 minutes, trying to come up with words that described who I was as a person, and I had nothing. Everything I thought of was tied to someone else. I was Dave's wife, Emma and Tyler's mother, my own mother's caretaker before she passed. But me? Just me? I had no idea. Dr. Chen said that was normal for women of my generation. We'd been raised to define ourselves through relationships, to find our value in how well we served others. And that's what made leaving so hard, because if I wasn't a wife, who was I? She gave me homework. Every day, I had to do one thing just for myself. Not for Dave, not for the kids, not for anyone else, just for me. And I had to write down how it felt. The first day I painted, it felt guilty, selfish, like I should be doing something productive instead. But I did it anyway, and I wrote about the guilt. The second day, I took a long bath in the middle of the afternoon. It felt indulgent, wasteful, but also kind of wonderful. The third day, I said no to Dave when he asked if he could come over to discuss reconciliation. It felt terrifying, empowering. Right. Slowly, through these small acts of self-care and boundary setting, I started to piece together who I was. And she was someone I was beginning to like, someone with opinions and preferences and dreams, someone who deserved more than crumbs, someone who deserved a full life. About 2 months into the separation, something happened that changed everything. Dave had been picking up some things from the house, and I was helping him pack. We were being civil, almost friendly, and for a moment, I wondered if maybe we could make it work. Maybe this separation had been the wake-up call he needed. Maybe he really had changed. Then his phone rang. He glanced at it, and I saw his face shift. That same expression from the day of my surgery, the calculation, the priority check. He answered it. It was Marcus from corporate. Some crisis with a client account. Dave listened, nodding, his whole body language changing. He was already halfway out the door mentally, already choosing work over this moment with me. He hung up and looked at me apologetically. He had to go. It was an emergency. He'd come back tomorrow to finish packing. He was sorry. And just like that, I knew. Nothing had changed. Nothing would ever change. Because Dave wasn't choosing work over me. He was choosing work because work was who he was. And I would never be enough to compete with that. I told him to finish packing now or leave it all. That I was done accommodating his schedule, done waiting for him to choose me, done being an afterthought in my own life. He looked shocked, started to argue, but I'd already walked away, gone to my room, the room that was mine now, and closed the door. I heard him downstairs for another 20 minutes, gathering his things. Then the front door closed, and he was gone. And I felt nothing. No sadness, no regret. Just this profound sense of relief. It was over. Really, truly over. I filed for divorce the next week. Susan handled everything, and it was surprisingly smooth. Dave didn't fight it. He was busy with work, after all. We split everything fairly. The house would be sold and the proceeds divided. His pension would be split. I'd get alimony for a few years while I figured out my next steps. It wasn't everything I deserved, but it was enough. Enough to start over. Enough to build a life. Enough to finally choose myself. The day the divorce was finalized, I went home and I painted. A massive canvas, bigger than anything I'd attempted before. I painted myself. Not as I was now, middle-aged and scarred and starting over, but as I might have been, as I could still be. A woman standing in the desert at sunset, arms outstretched, face turned toward the impossible sky. I painted until my hands cramped and my back ached and the light faded. And when I was done, I stepped back and looked at what I'd created. And I saw hope. I saw possibility. I saw myself. Not Dave's wife, not Emma and Tyler's mother, just me. And she was beautiful. The months after the divorce were strange, liberating and lonely in equal measure. I stayed in the house until it sold, then moved to a small apartment in downtown Phoenix. It was nothing fancy, but it had huge windows that let in floods of light, and I set up my easel right in the middle of the living room. I started painting seriously, taking classes at the community college, joining local artist groups. My work wasn't sophisticated, but it was honest, raw. People responded to it. I started selling pieces at local galleries, nothing that would make me rich, but enough to feel like I was building something. Emma came to visit one weekend. She walked through my apartment, looking at the canvases everywhere, and she started crying. When I asked why, she said she'd never seen me this happy, that she'd grown up thinking I was content, but now she realized I'd just been settled. And there was a difference. We talked that night, really talked, about marriage and sacrifice and what it means to love yourself. She told me she'd broken up with her boyfriend, the one who was always too busy to call back, the one who made her feel like she was asking for too much. She said watching me leave Dad had shown her that she deserved more. I hugged her and cried. And I thought about Patricia from the support group, about modeling strength instead of endurance, about teaching our daughters that it's okay to leave when staying costs too much. Tyler called a few weeks later. He'd been distant since the divorce, clearly struggling with it. But that night, he told me he'd been thinking about his own relationship with his girlfriend, about whether he was present enough, about whether he was making her feel valued. He said he didn't want to be like Dad, didn't want to wake up 20 years from now and realize he'd lost someone important because he couldn't see past his own ambitions. Hearing that from my son, knowing that my choice to leave had taught him something valuable, made all the hard parts worth it. Joan and I had lunch one afternoon, and she told me she was proud of me, that she'd been worried for years but didn't know how to say it, that she'd watched me disappear into the role of Dave's wife and wondered if I'd ever come back. I asked her why she'd stuck around, and she said, because that's what friends do. They wait. They hope. They stay ready for the moment you finally realize you deserve more. I started going to that support group regularly, not just as someone seeking help, but as someone who could offer it too. I shared my story with new women who were where I'd been. Stuck, scared, convinced they were asking for too much by wanting to be seen. I told them about the surgery, about lying in that recovery room alone, about the voicemail from Dave that changed everything. And I watched their faces as they recognized themselves in my story. One woman, Sarah, came up to me after a meeting. She said she'd been making excuses for her husband's emotional absence for 15 years, but hearing about Dave choosing work over my surgery had made something click. She realized she'd been in the recovery room alone too, metaphorically. That she'd had her own voicemail moments, her own times when she came second to everything else in her husband's life. She filed for separation the next month, and when she thanked me for giving her the courage, I realized this was part of my purpose now, not just healing myself, but helping other women see they deserve to be healed too. The art started selling better. I had a small show at a local gallery, and a critic wrote that my work had an emotional honesty that was rare, that you could feel the pain and the hope in equal measure. I framed that review and hung it in my studio, a reminder that my suffering hadn't been wasted, that it had created something meaningful. I thought about Santa Fe sometimes, about the scholarship I'd turned down, about the life I might have had. But I didn't regret the path I'd taken, because without it, I wouldn't have Emma and Tyler. I wouldn't have learned what I was capable of surviving. I wouldn't have this hard-won understanding of my own worth. I just regret that it took me so long to get here. One evening, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I was painting in my studio when my phone rang. It was Dave. We hadn't talked much since everything was settled, just the occasional text about logistics. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. He asked if we could meet for coffee. There was something he wanted to say. I agreed, curious, despite myself. We met at a cafe in Scottsdale, neutral ground. He looked older, tired. The kind of tired that comes from working too much and living too little. We made small talk for a few minutes, then he got to the point. He said he'd been thinking a lot about our marriage, about what went wrong, about his role in it, and he wanted to apologize. Really apologize, not just say the words. He said he'd realized that he'd treated our marriage like a business arrangement, that he'd taken me for granted because I was always there, always handling things, always making it easy for him to focus on work, that he'd never stop to think about what that cost me, what it cost us. He said he understood now why I left, that he didn't blame me, that if he'd been me, he probably would have left sooner. It was the first time he'd really seen it, really understood what he'd done. And it meant something. Not enough to change my mind, but enough to give me closure. I thanked him for the apology, told him I hoped he'd learned something from our marriage ending, that he'd be more present with whoever came next. He asked if there was any chance for us, if we could start over, knowing what we know now. I thought about it, really thought about it, because part of me still loved him. Part of me probably always would. But love isn't enough. It never was. I told him no, that I'd spent too many years being small to go back to that I'd found myself again, and I wasn't willing to lose her. He nodded, said he understood, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I believed him. We finished our coffee and went our separate ways. And as I drove home to my bright apartment with its big windows and canvases everywhere, I felt a kind of peace I'd never known in our marriage. I'd chosen myself. And that was enough. Winter came, and with it a kind of clarity. I'd been working with Dr. Chen on understanding not just what happened with Dave, but why I'd let it happen for so long. Why I'd stayed, why I'd made myself small. She introduced me to this concept of enablers, people around the main actors in a dysfunctional relationship who keep the system going, who make excuses for bad behavior, who pressure victims to stay or to forgive or to try harder. I started thinking about all the people who'd enabled Dave's neglect. His mother, who always said he was just a hard worker and I should be proud. My own mother, who said marriage was about sacrifice and I should stick it out. Friends who said all men are like that I was lucky to have someone so successful. Even me. I'd been my own biggest enabler, making excuses for him, telling myself it was temporary, convincing myself I was being supportive when really I was just being used. Dr. Chen said this was common, that we're taught from childhood that relationships require sacrifice, and we internalize that to mean we should sacrifice ourselves, our needs, our dreams, our very identities. And then we're surprised when we wake up one day and don't recognize the person in the mirror. I thought about this a lot, about all the women I knew who'd made themselves smaller for their partners, who'd given up careers or dreams or friendships because their husband needed them to, who'd convinced themselves it was love when really it was just learned helplessness. And I realized that my story, painful as it was, could help break that pattern. If I could show other women what I'd learned, maybe they wouldn't have to wait until they were 57 and alone in a recovery room to realize they deserved more. I started writing, at first just for myself, processing everything that had happened. But then I started sharing pieces of my story online, in forums and support groups, and women started responding, hundreds of them, thousands, all telling me they saw themselves in my words, that they were in recovery rooms of their own, literal or metaphorical, waiting for someone who would never show up. The responses were overwhelming. Women thanked me for putting words to their experience, for validating their feelings, for showing them that leaving was possible, that choosing yourself wasn't selfish. One message stuck with me. It was from a woman named Jennifer who said she'd been making excuses for her husband's emotional abuse for 12 years. That everyone told her he was just stressed, just working hard, just going through a rough patch. That she'd believed them until she read my story and realized stress doesn't excuse cruelty. Hard work doesn't excuse neglect. She said she was filing for divorce, that my story had given her permission to want more, to demand more, to be more. And I realized this was my rebirth, not just painting again, though that was part of it, but using my story to help other women find their way out of the fog, to show them they weren't crazy or demanding or selfish for wanting to be valued. That was the real gift of my suffering, not just my own healing, but the possibility of preventing others from going through the same thing. Spring came again, a full year since the surgery that changed everything. I was preparing for a larger gallery show, my first solo exhibition. The theme was transformation. Paintings of women at different stages of becoming. Women leaving, women arriving, women standing in the desert with their arms outstretched. Joan came to the opening. Emma and Tyler flew in. Even some of the women from my support group showed up. It was small but meaningful, this community I'd built from the ashes of my marriage. During my speech, I talked about the journey, about the surgery and the recovery room, and the moment I realized I'd been living half a life, about the divorce and the grief and the slow, painful process of becoming whole again. And I talked about the other women, the ones still in recovery rooms, the ones still making excuses, the ones still waiting for someone to choose them. I said, choose yourself. Choose yourself first. Choose yourself always, because no one else will do it for you. The crowd was silent when I finished. Then someone started clapping, and others joined in, and for a moment I felt what I imagine Dave feels when he closes a big deal, that sense of accomplishment, of doing something meaningful. Except my accomplishment wasn't measured in quarterly reports or profit margins. It was measured in the number of women who left that gallery knowing they deserved more. After the show, Emma pulled me aside. She said she'd been thinking about what I went through and about her own relationship patterns. She said she realized she'd been dating men like her father. Men who were always too busy, always distracted, always making her feel like she was asking for too much. She said watching me rebuild my life had shown her that it's never too late to start over. That settling for less than you deserve is a choice, and you can always choose differently. I hugged her tight and thought about all the generations of women who'd settled. My mother, her mother. How many women had lived half lives because they thought that's what love required? But not Emma. Not anymore. And maybe not her daughter someday, if she has one. Maybe the cycle was finally breaking. Tyler came up next. He said he'd talked to his girlfriend about marriage, about what they both wanted it to look like, about not repeating the mistakes of their parents' generation, about building something equal, something where both people could thrive. He said thank you for showing him a different way, for being brave enough to leave instead of staying and becoming bitter. And I realized that's what this was all about. Not just my healing, but showing my kids that it's okay to want more, to demand more, to walk away when staying costs too much. That night, after everyone left, I stood in the gallery surrounded by my paintings, these pieces of my pain and my hope and my transformation. And I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. I felt proud. Not proud like when I'd successfully managed Dave's life and kept the household running and made everything look easy. That had been pride in my usefulness. This was pride in myself, in my courage, in my art, in the woman I'd become through surviving. I walked home through the Phoenix streets, past the palm trees and the stucco buildings and the desert sky turning purple with sunset, and I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, lying in that recovery room, listening to that voicemail, making the choice to stop settling. I was grateful to her for being brave enough to start this journey, for choosing discomfort over complacency, for believing she deserved more even when everyone around her said she was asking for too much. Because she wasn't, and neither are you. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in my story, you're not asking for too much. You're asking for what you deserve. And that's everything. 1 year and 2 months after the surgery, I got an unexpected call. It was a woman named Maria who'd read my story online. She was a producer for a podcast about women's stories of transformation and recovery. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in sharing my story in a more formal way, reaching a wider audience. I said yes immediately, because if my story could help even one woman leave her own recovery room, it would be worth it. The interview went well. I told the whole story, from the surgery to the separation to the slow rebuilding of my life. And when it aired, the response was overwhelming. Thousands of messages from women thanking me, sharing their own stories, asking for advice. I started getting invitations to speak at events, women's groups, divorce recovery seminars, even a few colleges where they wanted me to talk about late-life reinvention. I said yes to as many as I could because I'd found my purpose. Not in being Dave's wife, or in managing his life, or in making myself small. My purpose was in being big, in taking up space, in showing other women that it's never too late to choose yourself. I kept painting, kept writing, kept sharing my story, and slowly I built a life that was entirely mine, a life full of color and connection and meaning, a life where I was the center, not the supporting character in someone else's story. Sometimes people ask if I regret the years with Dave, if I wish I'd left sooner, and honestly, I don't know. Those years gave me Emma and Tyler. They taught me what I didn't want. They showed me my own strength in a way nothing else could have. But would I do it again? No, never. Because now I know what it feels like to live a full life. To be whole, to choose myself every single day. And nothing, not even 22 years of history, could make me go back to being small. About 18 months after the divorce, I did something I'd been thinking about for a while. I applied to an art residency program in Santa Fe, the same city where I'd had that scholarship all those years ago. I got in. The residency was for 3 months, focusing on women artists over 50 who were experiencing a renaissance in their creative work. It felt like the universe's way of giving me a second chance, of saying, it's not too late. It's never too late. I packed up my apartment and drove to Santa Fe in late September. The city was exactly as I'd imagined it all those years ago. Adobe buildings and turquoise jewelry and that high desert light that makes everything look sharper, more real. The residency was transformative. I worked alongside other women who'd also sacrificed their art for family or career or some combination of both. Women who'd found their way back to themselves later in life. Women who understood. We painted and talked and shared our stories, and I realized I wasn't alone. That what happened to me, what I'd been through, it was part of a larger pattern. A cultural narrative that told women to be small, to sacrifice, to put everyone else first. But we were rejecting that narrative. All of us. Creating art that said we matter. Our stories matter. Our voices matter. I produced some of my best work during those 3 months. Pieces that were raw and honest and unapologetically bold. Paintings of women breaking free, of women standing tall, of women choosing themselves. When the residency ended, I didn't want to leave Santa Fe. So I didn't. I found a small studio apartment in the Arts District and decided to stay. At least for a while. Maybe forever. Why not? Emma and Tyler came to visit. We hiked in the mountains and ate at local restaurants and talked about life and choices and what it means to build something authentic. They seemed lighter here, away from the weight of Phoenix and memories of the family we used to be. Emma told me she'd started painting too. Just dabbling, nothing serious, but it made her feel connected to me. Connected to this lineage of women finding themselves through creation. Tyler said he'd broken up with his girlfriend, not because things were bad, but because they weren't great. He said he'd learned from watching me that settling for good enough was just another way of abandoning yourself. I was proud of them both, for learning these lessons younger than I did, for not waiting until they were 57 and alone in a recovery room to realize they deserved more. Before I end my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this, something that might help you if you're going through something similar or if you know someone who is. One of the most important things I learned was about the role of enablers in abusive or neglectful situations. I know that sounds clinical, but bear with me because this understanding changed everything for me. See, when we think about abuse or neglect in relationships, we usually focus on the two people involved, the person causing harm and the person being harmed. But there's almost always a third group, the enablers, the people around the situation who, knowingly or unknowingly, help keep the dysfunction going. In my case, the enablers were everywhere. Dave's mother, who always defended his work schedule and told me I should be more supportive. My own mother, who said marriage required sacrifice and I'd made my bed. Friends who normalized his behavior by saying all men are like that. Colleagues who praised him for his dedication without seeing what that dedication cost his family. Even Emma and Tyler, in some ways, though they were kids and didn't know better, had learned to work around Dave's absences instead of questioning them. But here's what's important to understand. Enablers aren't necessarily bad people. Most of them think they're helping. They're trying to keep the peace, maintain relationships, avoid conflict. They genuinely believe they're doing the right thing by encouraging you to be patient, to forgive, to try harder. The problem is that this so-called help actually makes things worse. It keeps you trapped in the situation longer. It makes you doubt your own perception of what's happening. It isolates you because you start to think everyone else sees it differently, so maybe you're the problem. Experts in family systems call these people flying monkeys, borrowing from the Wizard of Oz. They do the bidding of the person causing harm, often without realizing it. They carry messages, they apply pressure. They make you feel crazy for wanting things to change. Learning to recognize enablers was crucial for my recovery. I had to start setting boundaries not just with Dave, but with everyone who was pressuring me to stay in a situation that was killing me slowly. I had to learn to say no to my mother-in-law's guilt trips, to walk away from friends who minimized my pain, to stop explaining myself to people who'd already decided I was being too demanding. And here's what I want you to understand if you're in a situation like I was. The presence of enablers doesn't mean you're wrong about what you're experiencing. In fact, the more people rush to defend the person harming you, the more likely it is that you're seeing clearly, and they're not. Because here's the thing about enablers. They have a vested interest in you staying put. Maybe they depend on you to keep the system running. Maybe they're afraid that if you leave, they'll have to examine their own relationships. Maybe they just don't want to deal with the mess and inconvenience of things changing. Whatever the reason, their comfort with the status quo doesn't obligate you to maintain it. I learned to ask myself some key questions when people gave me advice about my marriage. Does this person have access to all the information? Are they seeing the full picture, or just the version Dave presents to the world? Do they have their own agenda that might influence their advice? Are they more concerned with my well-being or with maintaining appearances? Most importantly, I learned to trust my own experience. Because I was the one in that recovery room. I was the one who'd spent 22 years being secondary to quarterly reports. I was the one whose health had literally broken down from the stress of being invisible in my own life. No one else had to live my life, so no one else got to tell me what I should tolerate. If you're listening to this and you recognize these patterns in your own life, I want you to know something. You're not crazy. You're not too sensitive. You're not asking for too much. You're seeing clearly while others are choosing to look away. And you deserve people in your life who see you too, who validate your experience instead of explaining it away, who support your healing instead of pressuring you to go back to what hurt you. Cut off the enablers if you have to. I know that's hard. Some of them might be family or longtime friends, but your well-being is more important than their comfort. Your healing is more important than their convenience. Find people who get it. Support groups were crucial for me. So was my friend Joan, who'd been waiting years for me to see what she'd been seeing all along. And my therapist, Dr. Chen, who helped me understand the patterns without judgment. Build your own support system of people who want you to thrive, not just survive. People who celebrate your strength instead of punishing you for finally using it. Because here's what I know now that I wish I'd known at 25 or 35 or even 45. You teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate. And when you stop tolerating neglect, when you start demanding respect and reciprocity and basic human decency, you'll quickly discover who's in your corner and who's been standing in your way. Let the enablers go. Choose people who choose you. And most importantly, choose yourself first, always. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. It wasn't easy to tell, and I imagine it wasn't easy to hear, but I believe in the power of sharing our stories. In breaking the silence around what happens in relationships when one person gives everything and the other just takes. If my story resonated with you, if you saw yourself in that recovery room or in the years of making yourself small, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me what city you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Let's build a community of women who refuse to be invisible anymore. And if this story helped you in any way, if it gave you clarity or courage, or just the validation that you're not crazy, please hit that like button. It helps other women find these stories. It helps build the kind of community where we support each other instead of tearing each other down. I'd love to know, what would you have done in my place? Would you have left after the surgery? Before? Or would you have tried to make it work? There's no right answer, just your truth. Share it in the comments. If you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing to this channel. Every week, we share stories of women who've walked through fire and come out stronger on the other side. Stories of transformation and recovery and reclaiming your life. You don't want to miss them. And if you're hungry for more stories like this one, I recommend checking out 2 videos in particular. The first is about a woman who discovered her husband's second family after 30 years of marriage. The second is about a mother who had to choose between her adult children and her own happiness. Both are powerful reminders that it's never too late to choose yourself. Before I go, I want to leave you with one final thought, one lesson that's become my North Star since all of this happened. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Read that again. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Your needs matter. Your dreams matter. Your voice matters. And anyone who tells you otherwise, anyone who asks you to be smaller so they can be bigger, anyone who treats your pain as less important than their comfort, they don't deserve access to you. I spent 22 years being small, being quiet, being convenient, and it nearly killed me. Not literally, though the health problems were real. But it killed the woman I was supposed to become. The artist, the dreamer, the person who believed she deserved to take up space in the world. Don't wait as long as I did to reclaim yourself. Don't wait for a surgery or a crisis or a moment so painful it finally breaks through your denial. Start choosing yourself today. In small ways, if big ones feel too scary. Set one boundary. Pursue one dream. Say no to one thing that depletes you. Because here's what I know now. The life you're meant to live is on the other